Holocaust survivors recalled their agony on International Holocaust Remembrance Day last week. This to a world that they fear is in danger of forgetting one of the world's largest tragedies. At in-person and online events, both survivors and politicians warned about the resurgence of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. The United Nations chief also decried the resurgence of anti-Semitism. He said he was alarmed to learn recently that barely half of the adults worldwide have heard of the Holocaust, which saw the murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others during the Second World War. Well, joining us now to share with us her personal experience during the Holocaust is Miss Georgine Nash, who was just 7 years old when the Holocaust hit her home country of Hungary. Miss Nash, welcome to Forum Daily.
Pardon?
And thank you so much for sharing your story with us, ma'am. Now, upon reading your story, we know one of your earliest memories is of your father being forced to work in a Jewish labor camp during the Holocaust. So let's start with that. Can you tell us about his experience through your eyes as a young girl?
Well, yes, my father had to go into these forced labor camps when I was 4 years old. So this was like a few years before I actually got involved. And so the way that worked was that he had to leave us, my mother and I was an only child, and be with this group of people for about 3 months at a time. And then he was able to come back for a few months, and then he had to go back again. So my memory is that I was always crying when he was leaving. And he was reassuring me that he will be back. You know, as a small child, I just remember that I was very distraught that he was going to be leaving us.
And we eventually found out that your father was disappeared. Can you tell us the story of what happened to your father eventually?
Well, that was a lot later than that. So you see, I lived in Budapest, and there the Jews were really not involved in the Holocaust, or not until 1944. That's when I was 7 years old. From the outlying countryside, people were deported already years before, but the Budapest Jews were still intact. But in March of 44, the Germans invaded Hungary. And at that time, very, very quickly, Adolf Hitler, who was sent by Adolf Eichmann, was in charge of getting rid of all the Jews of Budapest. So what we first had to do was that we had to move out of our apartment and move into a so-called Jewish or Yellow Star house. And these were houses all over the city, about 3,000 of them, where other people lived, not only Jews, but all the Jews had to move into one of these houses. So my mother had some friends, and they said that we could come in. They lived in one of these houses, and we can share their apartment. And there my memory was that we moved in and we took whatever furniture we were able to take with us. And it was extremely, extremely crowded, furniture up to the ceiling. And this was in June when we had to move. Before that, in April, we had to start wearing the Yellow Star. So that was the very first thing that happened to the Budapest Jews. And after that, we had to move into the Jewish house. So we were in this Jewish house, and my memory there is that the Allies were bombing constantly, and every time there was an air raid, the siren sounded, and we had to go down to the bomb shelter. And one of the times when this happened, after it was called off and we were able to go back to our place, a very excited child reported that there was an unexploded bomb in the top floor in one of the armchairs of one of the apartments. So we all had to go and check this out, which we didn't realize how dangerous that was. So we were in the Jewish house, and after a while, it seemed that it was like we didn't know what the next step would be. I don't think that my mother and I were aware of deportations. And my father, as I said, was with us and then not with us. But at one time, the governor of Hungary, Miklos Horthy, announced that we are now not going to continue in the war on the side of the Germans. This is not us, but the Hungarians. Mm-hmm. And so we are out of the war. And just as fate would have it, at that time, my father was home.
You were telling us about your father. He was forced to work in a Jewish labor camp ever since you were 4 years old. After the Nazi occupation in Hungary, you were forced inside a home for Jews. At that time, your father didn't go to his regular work shift at this labor camp. So tell us about the significance of him not making it to work at that time.
Yeah, well, as I started saying, the governor announced that we're out of the war. And my father was home, just on a leave. And he said, well, if that's true, then I'm not going back to my unit. And so his commanding officer sent him a telegram urging him to come back to the unit. And my father was very adamant that no, we are finished with the war. He's not going back. And in this house, in this Jewish house, as I mentioned earlier, there were people living, not only Jews, other people as well who were not Jews. And one of them reported to the authorities that there is a person in this apartment who is actually should be in the army, but isn't, a deserter. And the Aerocross, who were the Hungarian Nazi Party, came by and picked him up and took him away. And we never, ever saw him again. And what I want to mention is that it was such an incredibly terrible, sad coincidence, because his particular group of laborer campers all survived the war. That whole group were able to come back because many of them were killed during these labor camps. So that was the one thing that my father made a decision which turned out to be the worst decision of his life. So after this, my mother and I moved into a so-called protected house. And these were houses also, several of them, along the area of the Danube, where different countries were protecting Jews who move in there. We moved into a Swiss protected house. And there was Wallenberg, Swedish, protected houses. We were in a Swiss one. And in one room, it was one of these a large bachelor apartment. 40 of us were put in there. And we were sleeping on the floor, like very, very crowded. However, one day, an Aerocross guy came and ordered everybody to go down to the courtyard for roll call. And my mother had the presence of mind to say that, I'm so sorry, but my child is very sick. She has high fever. Would you mind counting us here so we wouldn't have to go down? And this was in November, a very miserable, cold November day. And the Aerocross guy said, well, all right. And the other 38 people never came back. They were marched over to the Danube the very same day, and they were shot into the river. You see, by this time, they wanted to get rid of all the Jews of Budapest, and it was too slow to send them to Auschwitz. So there were these groups of thugs who came around and took people, and they just shot them into the river. So that was an absolute miracle that we survived that particular time.
Definitely, ma'am. A really heartbreaking story there. I wish I could ask you more questions about your experience, but just about a minute left here, ma'am. Let's leave with a message for our viewers. So as world leaders and survivors are decrying the resurgence of anti-Semitism in the world, what would be your message for our viewers when it comes to remembering and learning from this horrible tragedy?
Well, unfortunately, it seems that we haven't learned enough. It's very, very important, I think, for us survivors to talk to people and tell them about our story. When I hear that there are people who still deny that this ever happened, like I absolutely cannot believe it. And for people to understand that it's not only the persecution of Jews, but it's always a persecution of another group of people that people want to feel superior to. And as long as people feel that way, it's going to be very, very difficult to get rid of all that hate.
Ms. Georgine Nash, thank you so much for joining us today on Forum Daily and sharing your story with us.